Now, I can't say I've been super plugged into the community, but it seems there's a fair amount of people who found Rella to be an underused character, and I can't say I agree. I think her characterization is great for her given role, limited as it is. And in fact, the limited scope of it actually is what I'll argue makes Rella a greater metaphor for how fundamental Christianity views and treats women. All of this greatly contributes to why she ends up being a fantastic foil and/or mirror to all three of the women who join the party. So as you guys may know, I've been working on two humongous metaphor ReFantazio projects, and crazily enough, I got sidetracked, and what was gonna be a shorter discussion video on Rella became its own much longer analysis. The analysis on the music, its real-life historical inspirations, and how it contributes to Metaphor's world building will be over 2 hours long, and by the way, I'll include a relevant track as a sneak peek halfway into this video, so stay tuned. As for the collective anxiety, socioeconomic class and solidarity lens, political philosophy and resistance, and just overall metaphor of metaphors symbolism video, that's looking to be over an hour long itself. Just wanted to give an update on these videos. Otherwise, before we proceed with this one, I have two major disclaimers to cover. The first is that I have no problem with anyone who ascribes to a faith or religion for personal fulfillment or even community. I was a believer myself for over 20 years of my life. However, the buck absolutely stops if you're trying to force others who do not believe in your religion to still ascribe to its rules. If you want to live that way, go live that way, but you can't force and control other people to do so. Secondly, I'm going to be very critical about organized religion, namely Catholicism/Christianity and biblical scripture in this video. With all that covered, what is it about Rella that goes beyond just characterization and actually establishes her as a greater metaphor for the Catholic view and treatment of women? By the way, yes, the Catholic Church, because that's what sanctism is clearly emulating given the design of the robes and props and the fact that other things in metaphor like the music, art direction, and architecture are clearly inspired by Western European culture. Not to mention historical power tactics like co-opting the relics or spaces of other faiths to usurp their place in societal culture. Now, to be clear, sanctist doctrine and/or scripture is never outright shown in Metaphor ReFantazio's story, so it's unclear what the actual beliefs are. However, I argue there's more than enough of a certain attitude from the sanctist elites that perfectly aligns with that of the Catholic Church historically. So throughout this video, we'll be looking at the many Bible verses that undermine and even shame women. Now, the thing that stands out most about Rella is her service to the masses, something noticeably easy to compare to the sanctists around her. So let's see. Based on her actions throughout the game and how she chooses to go out in the end, there's no doubt she genuinely cared about serving and helping the people. It didn't matter what tribe they were from or their socioeconomic status. She would treat and heal everyone. Look no further than Basilio and Fidelio. She wasn't doing it simply for accolades, praise, or power, and neither were her healings staged nor faked. Forden, though? The complete opposite. Like, remember the sea monster terrorizing Oceania and Brylehaven? He surely must have known he hadn't killed the real human sea monster, but he was completely fine with lying and giving people a false sense of security. And how about Godot? He thought he was entitled to take Forden's place simply because he was, what, closest to him? Godot says,
I have been loyal to God and His Eminence Fortin my whole life.
Okay, and Rella wasn't? Not only that, she did way more for the people her entire life than you ever did? This dude in the crowd sums it up perfectly.
We know your name, but honestly, you don't have much in the way of real accomplishments.
So again, the thing that stands out most about Rella is her compassion and service to the masses, regardless of a person's background. This certainly makes her a beloved public figure and certainly makes sanctism look good. Historically, many orders of Catholic sisters have massively contributed to social services and serving those in need. These women risk their lives helping poverty-stricken communities, which naturally include those that are sadly plagued by disease. Similarly, we know in Metaphor's world that Magla can be dangerous. It can spread and contaminate other people and the environment via melancholisation. But Rella willingly puts herself in harm's way and treats people who have been affected. This also layers on how Rella handles the emotional labor of those around her. Fundamentalist Catholicism and Christianity in general adheres and indoctrinates binary gender norms, with women expected to shoulder the emotional burden of their husbands, families, and the wider community. Trust me, I'll get into scripture on this soon. Anyway, see the way Rella tries to protect Junah from feeling bad from having to kill her. Then there's the way the Sanctus faithful rely on Rella to comfort them when she's the one actually dying. The sheer juxtaposition with Eupha and her culture's evolved religion is really great. Edeni said back at the beginning of that arc that it's unfair of the village to pass all their anxieties onto Eupha alone to handle. But to get back to my current point, if there was an actual populist candidate for the church to put forward, it would be Rella, beloved for actually serving and spending time with the people. This makes her the only person who stands a chance popularity-wise after the literal Sanctifex's death, and the Sanctist elites are aware of that. But you can tell, they only care to use Rella as a pawn, and honestly, this is even prior to naming her Fortin's successor. Her good deeds and altruistic nature has always been great PR, so showcasing her publicly is great optics for sanctism. See the Colosseum at Brylehaven. And then once Fortin does actually kick the bucket, their intention is to set her up as a proxy of their control and political ambitions. She'll be better than Luis because the latter would certainly, without a doubt, purge the remainder of them. Anyway, main point is that Rella doesn't have a choice here. The Prince of Montario makes the threat clear. This is not exactly a request. And even then, she herself is still hesitant. See, there's a genuine and important difference between Rella and Junah's respective demeanors. Rella was the one who was raised under the Sanctist Church her entire life, by the way, while Junah wasn't necessarily prior to being adopted. Highly implied she wasn't. And this plays into why they're such great foils to each other. Junah is fiery and bold. She doesn't submit to a person or authority simply because reasons. They have to earn her trust and respect. Meanwhile, Rella does not draw attention to herself, particularly true whenever she's called upon by the Ukrainian and in practice entirely Sanctist Senate. So Rella is a huge contrast, demonstrating the kind of meekness and modesty that's encouraged of women via real-life biblical scripture. Though I want to be clear, there's nothing inherently wrong with being gentle or soft-spoken. But if it's due to other people essentially molding you to be that way, especially when you're still an impressionable child, that's really sad and dangerous. I'll get into more specific verses in a minute, but I first want to set this very important primer scene from about mid-game. It's when Godot proposes to Forden and the Senate that the next part of the tournament should be collecting the pagan's divine relics. Notice how he can just speak about his idea and is taken very seriously. Meanwhile, Rella remains good and silent, and only speaks up when Sanctifex Forden directly asks her what's wrong. It's only then that she voices her legitimate and relevant concern about the possibility of a relic that could nullify the king's magic. But what does Godot do? Just condescendingly responds,
You burden yourself with such fears. All you need to do is be a good saint. Smile, wave, and bless.
I'll repeat that again. All you need to do is be a good saint. Smile, wave, and bless. None of the men talk to each other so patronizingly in any of these scenes. This is the all too familiar "shut up woman, just do what you're told" attitude that a number of my girlfriends with way more fundamentalist parents were raised with. So both Catholics and Protestants make ample use of the New Testament, right? And what did the Apostle Paul say in 1 Corinthians 14:34? The women should keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be in submission, as the law also says. And what was the prevailing Old Testament law? Women are property of her father, then later that of her husband when she sold off to be married. The laws against rape and adultery aren't about protecting women, rather protecting and making reparations for the father's ruined property. You can read the full thing on screen right now, by the way. But basically, if a woman is raped and was not yet engaged, the abuser has to pay the father and then marry her. Already horrifying for the woman, but if she was already engaged, she's to be stoned with the rapist because she didn't cry for help. Now, to preface this next section, some of you might accuse me of using books with questionable authorship or divinely inspired authority. And look, guys, if it's in the canon or was in the canon at any given time, it's fair game to me. So 1 Timothy 2:12 says, I do not permit a woman to teach or assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. There's also 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 1. Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands. And later in verse 7, husbands, treat them with respect. But get this, as the weaker partner. Weaker how so? In what ways? What traits are considered strong? Which are considered weak? You might want to stay tuned for part 2 of my mega metaphor analysis. But back to the point, Rella does not draw attention to herself, nor voice her concerns or thoughts unless asked. Seriously though, essentially every time she does say something, it's in response to someone. She barely speaks unprompted, especially not among the Senate. This leads me back to how women have no consent. So an angel comes down from heaven and tells Mary, yeah, you're gonna be pregnant soon with the Son of God for the purpose of this narrative. And many scholars believe she was between 12 to 16 years old at this time. So what was Mary going to do? Say no to the all-powerful God? Similarly, in Rella's case, what could she have feasibly done? Forden is literally the Pope. He could have done whatever he wanted to Junah and the rest of Rella's family, since House Cygnus gained their prominence by working for the Sanctist elite. So clearly the church has them in the palm of their hand. Awkward transition, but to be straight up with you guys, I have skin in this game. I've grown up in the church my entire life, so my intention in sharing some of my personal experiences will become clear soon enough. But first, I want to pose it a question that I want you to keep in mind for this next section. just how much of Rella's actions are influenced by her innate nature, and how much is due to nurture and her particular life experiences, namely guilt and presumed indoctrination. So I come from a Protestant background, the majority of my adolescence having been at a fairly large church, over 500 members. Growing up, all of the women were expected, or at least encouraged, to serve, to cook, to clean, to volunteer. For real though, I am glad I learned a lot of great life skills from doing this throughout my life, and it did encourage me to volunteer in other communities outside of church. This included programs for low-income folks and other marginalized communities. This brings me to something really important that I couldn't help but admire about my dad and my mom when she was still healthy, and that was their embodiment of the servant leadership model. I think especially noticeable regarding my dad because he's a pastor. So point being, he didn't just talk the talk, but walk the walk. This is important in the context of Christianity at the very least, since you'd think you'd want to emulate Jesus Christ, right? The very person your religion is named after, a person who modeled the servant leadership philosophy. After all, Matthew 20:28 says, "The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve." I really respected my parents' integrity and this model they set for me, and back then when my mom was terminally ill and eventually bedridden when I was in high school, I felt really comforted by God's presence in my life. My family received a lot of help and I had this desire to give back. My favorite verse back then was 2 Corinthians 1:3-4, which you can read on screen right now. So prior to my transverse myelitis diagnosis, when I still had a lot of energy and physical ability to serve, that's what I modeled my own leadership style after. Ultimately, I realize in hindsight, I genuinely liked community building and engagement, and it's one of the things I truly miss the most now that I live with debilitating medical conditions. And even within these activities, I loved giving back to everyone who made the entire thing possible. One particular example, and a relevant one given Metaphor ReFantazio's instrumentation and some OSTs, I swear guys, the music analysis video is gonna slap. So in high school, I was on marching band staff all 4 years and co-band manager my senior year. So our job was to load and secure all these big things in the trucks. The sousaphones, the pit and drum lines, percussion instruments, as well as all of the uniforms, which was a lot for a nearly 200-person group. We also set up the field on top of other responsibilities like, those are 5 a.m. mornings, folks. And on game days, band staff wouldn't get home until midnight. My point is that no one asked me to join, no one forced me, I wanted to. But it's also true that my parents clearly modeled the value of being involved and giving back to community, friends, family. So how about Rella? How much of what she does was learned and indoctrinated as prominent sanctus beliefs or teachings? You know, being conditioned or unconsciously pressured to act in certain ways. Because her demeanor and actions do remind me of the way I've seen women in the variety of Christian spaces I've been part of over the years downplay their dedication to their husbands, children, family, and just wider communities. But as I covered earlier, there are many women and plenty of men who still believe in all the New Testament verses that say women shall never be in a position of authority above men. And let's just say, I remember times growing up where entire congregations split and people even left over what positions women were allowed to have. Having these kinds of beliefs hammered down over and over again is honestly really dangerous. It leads to so many young women growing up questioning their own judgment. I'm incredibly grateful to my parents that these very misogynistic verses were never brought up at home. My dad holds an egalitarian view, not complementarian, for those of you in the know about Christian interpretations of theology. So I always felt empowered by my parents. They never dissuaded me from pursuing and fulfilling leadership positions that opened up, most of these being in secular spaces. But this entire topic brings me back to even more examples of degrading women in scripture. This one from the Apocrypha, which again I am including because they were once considered canon and are still to this day in the back of Catholic Bibles. So Book of Sirach 42:14 says, "Even a man's wickedness is better than a woman who does good. It is woman who brings shame and disgrace." Definitely looking at Forden versus Rella here. And the justification for women to not speak in church from 1 Peter is because of Eve. She was the weak one and easily deceived, therefore not fit for these leadership roles and decisions. By the way, if she was the weak one, then why didn't Adam just say no? Just saying. Anyway, how sad that they are blaming a woman for her curiosity, for seeking knowledge. More on that and the Mage Academy in just a second. But back to the symbol of Eve, let's take a look at Rella's guilty conscience from dooming the prince and, fast forward to the royal tournament, the country. Let me explain. So she's one of, if not the only one, who knows of the kind of world Luis has envisioned for years and how innocents who did nothing wrong would die in his chaotic vision of humans overrunning the land. One thing leads to another, and suddenly she's also one of the only ones left who can feasibly challenge Luis. Though I can't help but think she also feels guilty and worries deep down that she doesn't have much longer to live due to the curse, while also being at full magic power, which she would need to be in order to stand against him. And this leads me to this. The only time she does sound strong and confident is when there's no other option and it's in protection of people. Before we fight her, she says this world is already harsh enough and full of suffering, that essentially the weak turn to religion and their faith for comfort. She already knows the truth behind dragons, what they actually are and how they brought about the end of the ancient civilizations. In other words, she knows monumental truths of their world, and it's all but indirectly stated that she likely knows the truth about Sanctism's origins and the Elda as well. I don't think it's implausible that Rella thinks if this religion were to be eliminated, something else will take its place. Sanctism itself, having risen out of the ashes of the old world's destruction, is proof of this. Humanity will always create new religions and faiths. It's people's attempt to cope and make sense of suffering, the problem of evil and the discomfort of not knowing why certain things happen in the world. You see, Rella is a naturally curious person, as we can see by what she rambles about in very rare moments, like in Brylehaven. She hopes to study the sea monsters/sea creatures here, but is cut short by Batlin, and I get that he can't exactly let her keep rambling on, but I can't imagine how many times she had been interrupted in that way by the Sanctus Powerful. Intellectual curiosity isn't exactly something that's encouraged in fundamentalist religious circles for either men or women. look no further than Batlin himself, right? But I argue even more so for women, because organized religious elites want to retain power. The more the people know, the less they can control the narrative, and therefore control people, which is exactly why the Mage Academy, a place of learning and knowledge, was destroyed by Forden, much like instances in our real-life history of the religious destroying knowledge. Christian missionaries destroying nearly all texts of Mayan religion and culture, book burnings during the Spanish Inquisition, and such things are continuing to this very day. I mean, upon inauguration, the current Christofascist administration in the United States removed and/or deleted actual scientific information and research on LGBTQ+, climate change, and so much more from the official White House pages, all to push their Christian nationalist ideas. So yes, Forden and the Mage Academy is such a fitting metaphor for the times. Meanwhile, what did Rella do in this case? Buy time for the students and instructors to escape, with the knowledge, to safety. Okay, intermission time. I'd like to take a moment to thank all my patrons and channel members for their financial support. I'm truly, truly grateful to you guys. I get that it's not an easy time for most folks right now. Now, I'm shooting to have that 2+ hour analysis on Metaphor's soundtrack and the real-life inspirations out by mid-April, and I've posted more in-depth updates and/or sneak peeks on Patreon, so if you're interested and have the means to throw some extra dollars my way, I truly appreciate it. Otherwise, just watching, liking, commenting, and/or sharing my videos goes such a long way, and I'm so grateful to all of you viewers. I personally don't mind how everything happened back to back to back in Altabury, and this brings me to the little sneak peek music analysis I promised at the beginning of this video. The new track called Stratagem that plays when we first arrive in Altabury and actually get to take control sets the atmosphere and tone perfectly, in ways I think goes underappreciated. So what struck me right away was the seriousness of this new track, specifically the percussion setting up this slower marching tempo. Knowing that our main goal was killing Luis with the Dracodius at this point, this clued me in that this was a funeral march, a somber song or lament expressing mourning or grief, usually performed at funerals from the 17th century onwards in most of Europe, particularly for military and state funerals. But then the main melody kicks in at the 30-second mark and really surprised me. At this point, we've already grown used to hearing this serious melody throughout the main missions of the game, so it primes and rewards eagle-eared listeners who will seek out the differences in this new arrangement of it. Like, what exactly is this new remix trying to tell us? So this time, it's even more somber, and I'll argue compositionally one of the darkest tracks in the game. It also perfectly sets up and takes advantage of Altabury's frigid setting. How? Take the instrumentation. Lots of metallic instruments here give off this icy feeling because hard surfaces reflect sound like ice does in winter. Okay, sorry, I'm briefly backtracking again. So even prior to the melody, there's this particular muted brass part that's really important. The mutes are used at the start or the attack of the note to take the edge off. This is typical of a more reserved formal setting like a funeral, but as you lift the mute off the bell of the instrument, it gets louder, and vice versa when you mute the bell again. It gives a noticeably harsher, piercing shape of sound than if this technique wasn't used. Very dramatic and sort of emulates a siren-like sound, like announcing approaching danger. Then the melody kicks in with the glockenspiel and piccolo. The accompanying oboe has a brighter sound out of the reed family of instruments, and its timbre pierces through the orchestra better than a clarinet or bassoon. So all three of these instruments together capture a daintier but still icy and metallic sound. And then the clarinets and what I believe is vibraphone take over for the next part. They offer this nice contrast, a warmer and mellower sound after establishing this frigid setting. And what they do bring to the table is how the lower and higher notes are not coming in at the exact same time, with the higher notes attacking first, then the lower harmony coming in right after. It perfectly emulates this slow, as if you're plodding or trudging your feet along sound. A literally heavy, weighed down feeling. Again, to sell the funeral march and its very somber character. And this brings me to the most tellingly darker variation on this familiar melody, at least in my view. So the full strings come in at the 1:15 timestamp with the exact same melodic line, but starting 2 intervals lower. So Western music theory uses what's called heptatonic scales, with each scale consisting of a 7-interval octave. So in this particular track, the familiar melody starts on the root note, or first interval, of B-flat instead of on the D-flat. The technique being used here is called sequencing, a restatement of a motif or melodic phrase at a higher or lower pitch in the same voice. This was commonly used in the classical and romantic eras of Western music tradition, though the significance of that to this track will have to wait for the main music analysis I'll link in the description once out. Anyway, starting on a lower note like this is just one way to make something sound more somber, though as a whole, this new arrangement also sounds darker because of its slower tempo. The usual melody feels more lively because it's played at a quicker pace. But this funeral march version makes extra sense given the physical setting of Altabury and the point that we're at in Metaphor's narrative. Have you noticed how deliberately this place is set up as a one-way path up this steep hill to the top of the opera house / monolith? Essentially, we are enacting an actual funeral procession in preparation for everything truly going off the rails and death everywhere. I mean, I love Del. I even got his tsundere little flute. But the guy has been a walking death flag ever since the fight with the human sea monster. So this track is saying, whatever happens, there will be a lot of sorrow and death. And that's what we got. Luis, Forden, Fidelio, Rella, all in a row. Like, I was suspecting something would happen with Forden because I couldn't believe we would kill Luis after only one actual fight, though I had no idea how it'd go down. But yeah, regardless, someone's favorite of the top 2 candidates was going to die. You're at this major, harrowing turning point in the story, and I was pleasantly surprised that this track remained only as an introduction to the crazy Altabury chapter. Like, I'm glad Metaphor stuck to its guns and wasn't afraid to kill such major characters in such rapid succession. Not to mention the public reveal of all the Crown Theocracy's corruption. To me, it really plays into the theme of collective anxiety and existential dread in Uchronia. The whole, oh shit, all of our society's leaders and institutions are toppling one by one and everything is on fire. What do we do? What do we do? So, okay, a critique on this arc, especially Rella's part, that I do get is the subpar way the Mage Academy played out. It definitely feels like there should have been a dungeon segment here. Considering how the fight against Rella was her testing us, I can easily imagine her setting up other trials or traps throughout the ruined school as part of the test to even get to her. Have her wait in a section of the ruins that we can't get to with the gauntlet runner, so we'd have to go on foot. Yeah, it does feel like there was some kind of cut or changed content here for two main reasons. The first is that Basilio feels like the odd one out of the party, as there's no dedicated dungeon in this arc, where he officially joins the team, at all. And it's good timing that he joins prior to the Mage Academy, which would have been perfect. This also feels like a perfect time to let Junah shine a little too, given how she goes on to head the Mage Academy in the epilogue. Maybe we could have even had more foreshadowing? Get it? But for real, such a shame given there's so much important history and lore here. The second reason is that the pacing of metaphor feels wonky from this point onwards. Again, I personally don't have a problem with how much of a back-to-back wham experience Altabury was, but considering how the rest of the game feels oddly empty from here, it does feel like there should have been an additional main story arc. Like, I'd bet money that there were a ton of different ideas they envisioned or even tried out for this place, but they had to eventually settle with what we got if Metaphor actually wanted to release when it did. But yeah, if Rella and the Mage Academy was pushed out just another 10 in-game days or so, everything else could have played out the same, and Metaphor's late game would have felt way more evenly spaced out. To me, it wouldn't have been out of the question for the Sanctist elite to be a bit more divided after Forden's death. I mean, some were already reluctant on making Rella the full-blown successor, so perhaps the church announces to the people they'll have an official decision and announcement in 10 days' time in front of the Opera House. This would shift things back to an in-game date of September 22nd instead of the 12th. Go on and proceed with the Rella fight and the Mage Academy, then everything else can play out the same duration-wise. Like, the public duel against Luis can still occur about 10 days after this event, so around October 2nd, then the Elda village and the prince returning to the public can take the same few days after this, but what we're left with is a Skybound Avatar and Tyrant Star finale segment that doesn't feel as jarringly long. It'd be about 20 days total instead of 30, and overall we'd still get the same total amount of available free days across the entire game, since I understand Katsura Hashino and team wanted to give players an ample amount of time to do all the optional stuff in one playthrough. If anything though, if there ever is an update to Metaphor ReFantazio and its latter half, I really hope it releases as DLC rather than a full-on re-release. And I really hope Rella doesn't join or become a party member for some strange reason. Her tragic ending I have no problem with, and there's no feasible way they can allow her to live. It'd also make her way less of a great foil to all the women in the party. And so we've arrived at the foil and or mirror analysis section. Rella is this to Junah, but especially to Eupha. See, both Rella and Eupha are the leading women of Sanctism and the Mustari's beliefs respectively, and both are expected to sacrifice for their faith/religion. Eupha is kind and warm, but also firm and strong-willed when she needs to be. When we look at the kind of mental toughness it takes to offer up your life in the protection of others, it's obviously no joke, and Eupha was more than prepared to do this. And yet, she also possesses this curiosity and strength to challenge everything she was taught, instead of killing herself with the lance to fulfill the prophecy she's heard her whole life. She re-evaluated based on new information. This human commanding the Mustari's dragon god just doesn't seem right. Eupha is able to reinvent her mission and purpose and awakens to one of the archetypes. Ultimately, she's the star for taking agency over her own life, as well as responsibility for her entire people's religion and the true understanding of it. But I also want to give credit to Edeni. He didn't want his sister to die and was willing to go against the religious indoctrination if it meant the possibility of saving her. Can you imagine how dark things could have gotten if Edeni was firmly in the camp of the old and false Mustari teachings, including sacrificing the priestess? I'm just glad there's no family infighting and that they're actually such a wholesome sibling relationship. Also, imagine if the party hadn't gotten to Eupha in time. Again, she still deserves the most credit, but there's no doubt the party's outside and therefore different perspective caused her to question Mustari beliefs more than she would have if she'd been on her own. This is why the access to knowledge and a diversity of viewpoints is so important. And this brings me to Rella. Her situation makes me so sad. She too is compassionate and kind, but also has a backbone and will fight to protect her own people, the Sanctist flock. And as I covered in earlier sections, she's a naturally curious person as well. She's done so much research all on her own, and her implicit characterization points to her knowing sanctism is made up. Yet she's still gracious enough to understand people turn to religion for comfort, that it's okay as long as people are not harming others. She herself is not dogmatic about any beliefs. She's not discriminatory to the Mustari, much like how Eupha is, vice versa, accepting of Sanctus in her follower ranks and later in the epilogue. All of these similarities to Eupha, and yet Rella doesn't get her own happy ending. It was already way too late, even prior to Metaphor ReFantazio's main plot starting. She was coerced at a younger age than even Eupha, a 12-year-old girl against one of the most powerful authorities in the entire country, and she sadly had no support that night from anyone else unlike Eupha. And so, she cast that curse on the prince, which ended up sapping her own life forever. Additionally, Rella's spell backfiring, with it being an inverse of a healing spell, makes a great juxtaposition to Luis, who uses inverses of healing spells without detriment to himself. It was incompatible with her nature, and her fate was written in stone from that day on. That brings me to Rella and Hulkenberg. They're both from aristocratic families in Montario, both under the command of powerful political forces, ones that oppose each other at that, since childhood. Now, Hulkenberg isn't close to her family, though. She was already an outcast from a young age. Though, in hindsight, this ended up being a good thing for her, since it certainly made her more comfortable with detaching from them. It's true she was ashamed to return to Montario after her failure to protect the prince, but she clearly became strong and self-sufficient in the years after in her quest to find any sign of him. And of Hulkenberg's protective nature and loyalty? It's a trait that defines Rella too, protecting Junah, the weak who rely on sanctism, even her family, as scummy as they are, though this is the main thing that separates them. Rella was always trapped under her family's legacy. The same exact night that ended up sending Hulkenberg on a journey that ultimately built up her independence was the same night that doomed Rella from ever truly having her own. And finally, Junah. Her motto of,
I am Juani Cygnus, and my life is...
Yes, yes, your life is your own.
Sums up the juxtaposition to Rella perfectly. If the latter truly was indoctrinated the way most women who are raised in devoutly religious families are, then her life never was her own. So it's clear why Rella admires Junah so much. There's a part of her who wishes she could have been that bold, that brave, that free. I really can't help but notice how the Sanctus faithful look to Saintess Rella in the same way so many Christians look to women to take care of everything. Complete self-sacrifice, put their identity as daughter, sister, wife, and mother first before themselves. Overall, all in service to the male figures/characters. Like, look at the tendency to remove all personhood from the few women who are notable in the Bible and venerated by the Catholic Church. Let's look at Mary Magdalene of the Biblical Gospels, not to be confused with the mother of Jesus Christ, Mary, by the way. Now, Mary Magdalene is mentioned more times than any other woman in the canonical Gospels. She traveled with Christ's ministry and was a great financial supporter, and yet very little else is known about her life. Nevertheless, she's been elevated to saint status by the Catholic Church and has been one of the most popular saints since. And how about Mary, mother of Jesus? Why exactly is she so revered? For birthing her son. She's the most respected woman in the Catholic faith, yet we know remarkably little about her too. In the New Testament, there is nothing about Mary's birth, death, appearance, or actual age, like outside of the accounts of the birth of Jesus that only occur in 2 of the 4 Gospels, Matthew and Luke. She is specifically mentioned at only 3 other events in the life of her son. And yet during the Black Death, a plague that killed almost 50% of Europe's 14th century population, the Virgin Mary was one of the most popular figures that the Catholic devout prayed to. This goes back to the concept of how the people pass on all their anxieties to Rella, and she willingly takes them as well. Her identity is tied to how helpful she can be to the people, and that's it. She doesn't get to go on a journey of self-discovery like the women in the main cast do, and it goes even further than that. There's no way she can continue to live if we want the prince to be revived. And we know how things must go for Metaphor ReFantazio's story to play out. So I'm glad this game didn't throw us a miracle for Rella and had this greater metaphor play out to its tragic conclusion. If you're from a Catholic, Christian, or just some kind of monotheistic background, I'd love to hear from you in the comments, especially my fellow ladies out there. What are your thoughts on these characters and/or how Metaphor tackles religion? Given the topic of this video and just the themes of Metaphor ReFantazio as a whole, I can't not say something. Ever since the inauguration, everything has been on fire in the United States. Edit. Okay, so since Friday, March 14th, things are looking really bleak here. I get it. But nothing has ever gotten done in the history of anything without people fighting for it. The only alternative is giving up. So We can't do that. We must resist all these authoritarian, illegal actions from billionaire robber barons. So if you want to get involved in the fight, like actually do something instead of just doom scrolling, and I get it, I know. I'll leave links down in the description below. But yeah, thanks for joining me on this topic that's very close to my heart. Please like and subscribe if you like this, and finally I want to thank all my patrons and channel members who make this possible, especially my Special Fusion supporters, Big Clingy, Sam Bezjak, M. Meownlin, Malcolm Lowry, Peter Shepard, Andy, Jimmy Tapiz, Frank Sasaki, Undercloak421, Phoenix Black, and Brian Zen24.